All right, well, thank you all so much for joining us for tonight's program. 2024 Mass Book Award finalist Larry Rohter will discuss his new book, Into the Amazon, Life of Candido Rondon, trailblazing explorer, scientist, statesman, and conservationist, in this installment of Author Hour in Massachusetts. So a little bit about Larry. A journalist and author, Larry Rohter was the Rio de Janeiro bureau chief for the New York Times from 1998 to 2008 and held the same role at Newsweek from 1977 to 1982. He divides his time between the United States and Brazil. And I would just note that Into the Amazon was a 2024 Massachusetts Book Award finalist, an honorary book. So one of the best nonfiction books written last year by a Massachusetts author. And it's about one of the greatest explorers known to man. So with all that said, all 75 of us or so who are watching live and the many more that will watch the recording, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Larry for joining us here tonight. And Larry, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Robert. And thanks for inviting me. It's always wonderful to have an opportunity to speak about Rondon because I think he deserves to be better known in the English language world. And that was one of the objectives in writing my book. And to see that other people are also interested in him, curious about his life and his achievements, is always gratifying. So let me start at the very beginning, which is why I wrote this book, the origins of it. And to do that, I guess I would have to go back to 1978 when I made my first trip into the Amazon. And I was working for Newsweek at the time. And just out of happenstance, the first place I went was what is now the state of Rondonia, named after Rondon. And I didn't really know a lot about him at that time. All I knew was that here's this state named after this guy. It's the only state in Brazil that bears the name of a real person. So he must have been somebody extraordinary. And I spent, I don't know, I guess 2 or 3 weeks roaming around the Rondonia. And I have to say, it was a really tough, at times excruciating experience. The weather, the lack of roads, or what they called roads, but were really just bumpy trails, the insects, the threats of snakes and alligators and, poisonous butterflies, you name it, from the big stuff down to the little bugs that flew into your ears and your nose. It was not a pleasant experience. And so I started to think to myself, here I am. It was 1978. And I was thinking to myself, wow, it's really hard here to get around and do work. And here we are in the last quarter of the 20th century. Rondon came through here, opened this up really to exploration, the first person to come through a lot of sections of the state 75 years ago. What kind of person must he have been? He must have been tough as nails to come in and do these missions year after year after year. And so I resolved that when I got back to Rio, which was my home base, that I would find out more about him. And of course, this is way, way before Google or the internet or anything. So that took some effort. But I went into the used bookstores looking for material about him, and into what was available in the archives, just so I could learn about him. And of course, the more I learned, the more impressed I was, the more extraordinary he seemed. Here's a guy who was born in 1865. He's born the same month that Abraham Lincoln is assassinated. And he is born in this little, you can't even call it a town. It's too small to be a village. It's just this hamlet. And he is born in this area of the most backward province. They were provinces then, not states, because Brazil was then ruled by an empire. The most backward part of the country. And yet through this extraordinary force of will, this extraordinary sense of discipline, he got out of that very confined world where he was expected to grow up to be a cowboy, and he made his way to the military academy in Rio de Janeiro, then the capital of the empire, and he rose from buck private all the way up to marshal of the Brazilian army. Extraordinary, extraordinary for anybody to do that from a poor rural background. But there was more to him than that. He was pretty much an orphan. His father died before he was born. His mother died when he was 2 years old. He was raised by a grandfather and a godmother in this little village where he was born. And it was an Indian hamlet. And he was of mixed racial descent, mostly of Indian descent from the Bororo and the Ticuna peoples, but also there was Spanish and Portuguese, antecedents. And when I did the work on his family tree, of the 16, would it be great great grandparents, one was Afro-Brazilian, black, we would say in the US. So he's this complex racial mixture from this very poor rural background, and yet he becomes this leader in the Brazilian army and one of the key figures in Brazil's transition from an empire to a modern republic. So what did he do? Well, if you look at Brazilian history between 1889 and 1958, which is when he died, he was in his 93rd year when he died. He died after Sputnik went up in the air. So imagine that life, born the month that Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, and you die several months after the Russians sent Sputnik up. So he had this long, rich, full life. And he's involved not just in exploration, in these extraordinary missions, uh, leading expeditions into the Amazon, hence the title, but he's also involved in politics. He's a scientist as well. He is the father of environmentalism in Brazil. He's just this uh, figure with his fingers in a lot of pies at different points in his life. And there's so many things about him that are unusual, not just his background, but he rose to become general and then marshal, but he was always a pacifist. And his motto, his personal motto, was die if you must, but kill never. And this is apparently a contradiction. A pacifist general, how could that be? But it's something so unusual that when Albert Einstein came to Brazil in the 1920s, he was fascinated by Rondon and nominated him for the first time for the Nobel Peace Prize. Rondon would be subsequently nominated twice more, but never win it. But this combination of pacifism and being a military officer is one of the features that makes him, I think, unique in not just the history of Brazil, but in military history anywhere. Now, as I indicated, he was of indigenous descent, and one of the roles that he played as Brazil became a modern republic was the protector of the indigenous peoples. He was the founder of the Indian Protection Service in 1910, and he headed that for 20 years, for the rest of his military career, even as he continued to explore. And he recognized in 1910 that there was the possibility of a genocide that would wipe out these people, these indigenous peoples that he was so indebted to uh, in his work, who helped him as he explored and moved across the Amazon jungle. And so he pushed and lobbied and worked the press and worked the political side to get this Indian Protection Service established. And it did remarkable work to prevent uh, farmers, ranchers, miners, loggers, uh, the whole developmentalist um, panoply of invaders from taking over the Amazon. Now, he remained in the army until he was 65, that's 1930. Then he was expelled for political reasons. There had been a revolution in Brazil. Well, they called it a revolution. It was a coup, really. And it brought into power a dictator named Getulio Vargas. And Rondon had philosophical discrepancies with this dictatorship, and so they booted him out of the army. And he spent really the rest of his life as a scientist. He had done scientific work while in the army. Uh, he had written scientific papers on all sorts of different subjects, hard science and softer sciences. His favorite areas, I would say, were linguistics and anthropology. I count 8 different indigenous languages that he learned, in addition to the fact that he spoke Portuguese, Spanish, French, and German. So he wrote these papers. He was active in founding the first environmental groups. He did a diplomatic tour on behalf of the League of Nations from 1930 to 1934. And he also wrote books on indigenous peoples and their cultures. And uh, during the years of World War II, when the dictatorship, the fascist leaning dictatorship, was flirting with the Nazis and Mussolini, Rondon was a key player in resisting that and in making sure that Brazil went into World War II on the Allied side. Now, Brazil sent 25,000 troops to fight in Italy, but the real contribution it made was geographic, because there was the northeastern Brazil is the closest part of the Western Hemisphere to Africa. So there was this huge, uh, airlift from Miami down to the mouth of the Amazon, and then the northeast of Brazil, and then over to Africa to bring all kinds of weaponry and aircraft and tanks and jeeps and guns and ammunition to the Allied forces in North Africa, and eventually to the Allied forces in Europe itself. So this service that he performed is really essential to the Allied victory in World War II. After the war, he was getting quite up in age. Plus, his health was beginning to fail. He lost his sight in one eye and partial sight in another eye. but he was active to the very, very end of his life. He gave his last interview, oh, I'd say 8 or 9 months before he died. And true to his vocation as an opponent of dictatorship, he helped block an attempted coup in 1956, 1957. Uh, he supported a democratically elected president who wanted to move the capital to Brasilia. And Rondon, of course, had been in that area in the 1890s. So here we are 60 years later, and his vision is coming to fruition. So, it's a cliche to say someone is a Renaissance man, but Rondon really kind of fits that bill. Now, let me talk a little bit more about him as a person. Uh, he was married, he had 7 children, but he was not present for the birth of any of his children, 6 daughters and a son, because he was always off on an expedition somewhere. And his wife was usually back in Rio, although occasionally she would come to the site of his back base where he launched his expeditions from. And uh, one of Rondon's great early achievements was that he built a telegraph line of over 1,000 miles from what was then the end of civilization within Brazil to a major tributary of the Amazon River. And so he taught his wife Morse code so that at the end of his workday, he could talk with her via Morse code. I'd love to know what he and she said to each other, but there's no record of it, unfortunately. And I did a lot of deep dives into Brazilian archives, but never found any sign of those communications. But there is a rich body of documentation of his career, both in the archives of um, the Army, the armed forces in general, the foreign ministry, and the agencies that he headed, the national, the Indian Protection Service and its successor in later years. So I was able to do something. As Robert said, there's quite a number of books about his uh, participation in an expedition with Theodore Roosevelt in 1913 and 1914. Some very good books. I think the best one known is written by Candace Millard called River of Doubt. And Edmund Morris also wrote Colonel Roosevelt, in which Rondon appears. But uh, neither of them had access to these uh, Brazilian government documents. And I think that gives us a broader and richer portrait of Rondon as a person and also of his relationship with Roosevelt and um, what their joint expedition was like. Now, one of the reasons I felt compelled to write this book was that Rondon traditionally has been treated as a secondary or tertiary character. As I say in my introduction, it's as if you read a lot of the early coverage, and the press at of the contemporary period of 1913, 1914, and there always are references to Rondon as Roosevelt's native guide. Well, that's nonsense. Um, Rondon was an experienced expedition leader, and Theodore Roosevelt and his son Kermit were actually tagging along on one of Rondon's regular expeditions. And yet, you find in a lot of the English language documentation or accounts of that expedition that Rondon has been written out. Both the National Geographic and the British, Geographical Society have done that. And that struck me as really unfair, and I wanted to set the historical record straight. Um, and the catalyst really was in 2010. I was back from Brazil. I was working for the New York Times on the culture desk, uh, and there was a book review of Edmund Morris's Colonel Roosevelt, and there was a photograph, and Rondon's in the photograph along with his team, and they're sitting there with Roosevelt and Kermit and their team, and there's no identification of Rondon. And I thought, well, wait a minute, Rondon's the expedition leader. He needs to be given his proper place in history. Um, and I can do that. And so that's really what spurred me after years and years of saying, oh, someday I should write a biography of Rondon. Um, that's what really spurred me to get this rolling and done. This book came out in Brazil in Portuguese in 2019. The pandemic kind of slowed things down um, in getting it published in the United States, but it came out in hardcover in 2023 and in paperback last year. Um, it's it's reached the audience that I hoped it would. It got good reviews, and I get email all the time from people who found him fascinating and thank me for writing the book. And I hope it has a good long life. Um, I guess I should stop maybe here and let Robert fire away and make sure that we have time also for questions from you folks, which I'm happy to answer as long as they keep coming.
Great, Larry. Excellent, excellent synopsis of the book. Folks, if you have any questions for Larry, you can start getting them into the Q&A box, and I promise to start asking them in the next 10 to 15 minutes or so. So, Larry, I do have a few questions for you, though. I did read the book. I finished it today. And so a couple of things I wanted to ask about in particular was his absolute nonviolence towards indigenous people, his die if you must but kill never.
Yeah,
So he made peaceful contact with dozens of indigenous groups.
true.
How did he go about doing this?
Well, first of all, he had a different mindset than we had here in the United States. It helped that he was himself largely of indigenous descent. If you want to break it down, you could say he was 5/8 indigenous descent. So he grew up in that world, and he appreciated it for its value and its reverence for nature. So he approached anytime he was beginning a project, the first thing he would do was ride in unarmed to a village and talk to the headman, to the chief. And he would spend days, sometimes even weeks with them. Some of them spoke Portuguese, others did not. He already, as a child, had learned a couple of indigenous languages because of his background, and he started with the Bororo, his mother's own people, and um, he from that experience he developed a template of how do you peacefully contact indigenous peoples? How do you make them your partners rather than your enemies? And he developed a system where he would say, "Look, I want to build this telegraph line through your territory, and I would like for you to be the guardians of it, to administer it and protect it. And we will pay you for your labor and your services, and bring you, other benefits, health care and schools for your children." So it's a very different approach from, let's say, the U.S. 7th Cavalry. And it's an entirely different approach from whoever it was who said the only good engine is a dead engine. I can't remember now who said it, but we've all heard that horrible expression. Um, and once he developed this template with his mother's people, the Bororo, he then used it, applied it with other peoples as he went deeper and deeper into the jungle. And he formed these alliances with indigenous peoples, um, and got them, uh, persuaded them to join in and work on these projects in return for food and weapons and the promise of medical care. Uh, and he really honed this thing to a a fine working machine. One of Roosevelt's people on the expedition was astonished as they're paddling down some remote river somewhere to see these posters on trees showing Brazilian soldiers embracing the Indians and giving them gifts. These are pre-literate languages and cultures, and yet Rondon found a way to communicate with them. And he assembled a work team that was completely committed to his nonviolent approach. He had to wean them off of the typical soldier's mentality and um, instruct them, teach them how not to respond if an arrow is fired at you or shots are fired in the air. And as I said to Robert before we began this, he didn't just talk the talk, he walked the walk. He was himself once struck in several parts of his body by arrows in an ambush. And fortunately, it didn't kill him. It didn't even really injure him seriously because he was wearing one of those bandoliers, and one of the arrows got stuck in the leather of the bandolier, and another one got stuck in his pith helmet. So he was always true to this philosophy from the beginning all the way to the end. That's a long answer, but it's a complex subject.
I appreciate long answers, Larry. That was great. Can you talk a bit about his religion and positivism? Am I saying that correctly?
Yes, positivism. Right. Well, Rondon was a Francophile. He loved France and French culture. And as a cadet at the military academy in Rio, he became very much enamored of the French philosopher Auguste Comte, who is the father of positivism. And positivism is an altruistic philosophy that um, that then later became a religion, uh, and it posits that men are essentially equal in moral ability, but we're at different stages of development. Nobody's inherently inferior, but the people whose societies are more advanced have an obligation to help those that are further behind, to bring them up to speed. And Rondon just loved this idea. And unlike many of his friends in the academy, he remained true to that philosophy for the remainder of his life. And in a certain way, it stunted his career because one of the tenets of positivism is that you not participate in partisan politics. So throughout his career, Rondon was constantly turning down offers to run for senator, governor, be a minister of in the government, the federal cabinet. He was a couple of times offered the presidency if he would participate in military coups, and he always turned those down. So this religion, this philosophy, which became a religion, um, really was the dominant influence of his life. And he always believed in the philosophy that the essence of this philosophy, which was order uh, in order to achieve progress, and the end goal being love, a sharing um, of positive feelings with all of mankind. It was Auguste Comte who invented the word altruism and is the father of sociology. So you can see how that would have impacted Rondon.
Larry, did Rondon have any flaws? Maybe he should have gotten his eyes checked a little earlier. But other than that, what were some of his flaws?
Well, I mean, it's funny. Um, when this book came out in Brazil, and I did book tour down there, uh, people were saying to me, we've always been taught uh, in school that he, was this flawless individual, and yet, we see now that you've presented a more balanced portrait of him, that he did have some flaws. And one of the things that people that kept coming up were people saying to me, "How could he be so absent from his family? How could he not be there when his children were born, or when they got married, or when one of his daughters died? How could he leave his wife behind?" Um, and from our point of view, that's a valid criticism. In the 21st century. At the time, he and his wife, when they got married, they had a conversation, and she knew he was going to be away a lot of the time serving the nation, because his philosophy was the nation comes first. And also, since we're on this subject, he was a tough guy to work for. He was extremely demanding of himself, and uh, um, he expected the same of the men that he was in charge of. He wanted them to be just as committed, just as durable as he was. And when uh, they weren't, he was angry, and in some cases, uh, he actually whipped some of his soldiers who tried to desert or tried to steal the payroll and abscond off into the jungle. So he was a very hard as nails commandant.
Yeah, didn't like violence, but did at times have to do corporal punishment. I know
Yeah,
kind of a
yeah. There's a contradiction there, isn't there?
I think there is. I think at times too he was also maybe a little stubborn. One of the things I liked early in the book was his time at the military academy. And Larry, what happened when he didn't get the highest score on one of the exams?
Yeah, I mean, he was really obsessed with being at the top of his class, and uh, he when he didn't get the highest score in an exam, he would do things like he'd go to the teacher and ask that the exam be changed. Um, he once in an engineering exam, he didn't get the high score because he tried to find a elegant solution using calculus, and he finished second. And he went to complain to the professor, and the professor said, "You don't need to be elegant. I'm looking for the simplest solution. There was no need for you to do this to show off." And so he got very mad, and he blew off the course for the rest of the semester, and out of pique. And then he was going to flunk, and they might have had to kick him out, but the um, the staff recognized his talent and allowed him to take a makeup exam, and of course he aced that. Um, yeah, he just had this thing about excelling. He always wanted to be the top guy, and maybe it's because, and I haven't mentioned this, and I'm not Freud, but he really was a smaller guy. He was 5'2", 5'3" max. He weighed maybe 115 pounds. If you see pictures of him with Roosevelt, Roosevelt kind of towers over him, and Roosevelt was 5'8", 5'9". So, some people say that Rondon had a bit of a Napoleonic complex, and he did in fact admire Napoleon among other people, including Benito Juarez in Mexico. Um, so yeah, he's a complicated man, and uh, there came a moment when I was writing this book where I had his army jacket. It talked about everything he'd done every day in his career, where he had been. And I looked at it and I said, okay, I know everything he's done, but I still don't know who he is. And I was fortunate enough later on when I was researching in Brazil to find his diaries, 65 years of diaries. And that really helped me, um, as a mirror into his mind and into his heart.
Yeah, every time you cited his diaries, it was always fascinating. And yes, I was going to comment that you said his appearance is not traditional of what you would expect of an explorer.
No, I
Larry,
mean,
yeah,
especially at the time he was active, there was this image of, the Buana, the tall blonde guy with the pith helmet and the riding crop, and here's Rondon, and he's 5'3", and he looks like what he is. He looks like a mixture of three races, and so, at the time, uh, uh, I think racism was so prevalent that he didn't get um, the recognition he deserved because the powers that be in the world of exploration just couldn't fathom someone like Rondon. An indigenous guy who spoke, 5 European languages and a bunch of indigenous languages, who was an intellectual, and he just broke the mold, and so he didn't get the recognition that people like Amundsen and Scott and Perry, or Stanley and Livingston got. I mean, Stanley and Livingston did what, one trip through East Africa? Rondon did, I don't know, 15 or 20 different expeditions through the Amazon in conditions that were equally or tougher than what the others had to endure.
yeah, very, very, small physical stature, but
Yeah,
very mentally strong. I mean,
yeah,
and you talked about how he would wake up at 4 o'clock every morning, and the first thing he would do is go for a long swim, and that he didn't drink alcohol.
right.
My goodness. So I guess throughout his career, I think you said he had done over 25,000 miles by
Yeah,
foot, in the water, on horseback. Pretty incredible. Pretty incredible.
yeah,
I wanted to one of my favorite parts of the book is, or maybe like one of the more exciting. The book is amazing, but one of the most exciting parts, the one that stands out in my mind, is very early in his military career. But I think this really helps him gain the trust of the folks at the top. Is when the army was considering overthrowing the government, but the army wasn't sure where the navy felt, how the navy felt about it.
yeah.
Can you talk about Rondon's role in that whole
Sure,
episode?
sure. Yeah, I mean, the empire comes to an end in November of 1889 when there is a military coup to install a republic. And Rondon was a fervent Republican, and an anti-monarchist. So he's involved in that plot, initially as a bodyguard for the leader of the coup. Um, but at one point, he is sent uh, on horseback from Army headquarters to Navy headquarters to sound out, is the Navy going to come in on this or not? And he was told, look, if they're not going to join us, then you're likely going to be jailed. You're going to be imprisoned. And God only knows what's going to happen after that. But he was up to that risk. And, he carried this letter, and the Navy said, yes, we're in. And he turned around and then galloped back to Army headquarters and participated in the overthrow. And when the military comes in, to take into custody the emperor's prime minister and his cabinet, there's only one person in the room who's not white, and that person is Rondon. So he's there at at this historic moment in Brazil's evolution in a junior role, but he's there. He was only 24 or 25 at the time.
Yeah, and so if the Navy had a different answer, there would no longer be a Rondon.
Yeah, who knows? Yeah,
It could have been court-martialed, and who knows what else.
right, right.
Okay, so we'll get to audience questions here. We have a handful already. So Suzanne asks, is Rondon considered a national treasure in Brazil? Also, what is considered to be his highest achievement?
Well, yes, he is a national hero. I mean, he's the only, even today, there's only one person with a state named after him, and it's Rondon. But beyond that, he, let's see, there's airports named for him, there's cities named for him, universities named for him. He's been on the money, on the currency, on bills of large denominations. Um, yeah, he's a leading figure in Brazilian culture and history. I guess if you wanted to compare him to the United States, he's a combination of Lewis and Clark with Johnny Appleseed and an anti-Custer thrown in. Um, so he has all these qualities rolled into one. So yes, he's very much a you know, statues of him everywhere, shrines. Yeah, he's a leading figure. Now, the tougher part of your question there is his leading achievement. I guess it's, I mean, there's two things that Brazilian kids are taught in their civics classes early on. And it's two facets of Rondon's personality and achievements. The first is one we've already mentioned several times, which is this absolute nonviolence. Die if you must, but kill never. Brazil has a terrible problem with the way it's been treating its indigenous population since the military coup of 1964, and then the building of the Trans-Amazon Highway. So Rondon stands as this kind of sterling example of another way of doing things, and he's constantly being cited by anthropologists and scientists and other people who work to try to preserve indigenous cultures. So that's one aspect. The second thing would be the way he mapped the Amazon, opened up the Amazon, and established contact between the original inhabitants and mainstream Brazilian civilization. Building the telegraph lines and bridges, and he was a military engineer, so all of this was natural to him. So this physical infrastructure that made it possible for the Amazon to be incorporated into Brazilian society is also a major achievement. Now, the two of them are kind of contradictory because it was the infrastructure that he built that then later on enabled these depredations that plague Brazil today. But of course, history, as the saying goes, 2020 hindsight. He didn't foresee that things were going to develop the way that they did. He had a much more optimistic view of mankind and what could be achieved. And once he realized about 1940 what was really going on and that there was no turning back, he changed his attitude and his philosophy, and he worked from that point on to try to block the mindless development of infrastructure in the Amazon.
Well, that leads us into Marcia's question.
Okay.
How successful was he in protecting the Amazon from development and the indigenous peoples from exploitation?
Well, in his lifetime, I think he did a pretty good job. Um, in the book, I say that in 1910, there could easily have been a genocide in Brazil. There was clamor for the government to just wipe out the Indians. So, they're a hindrance to our development, to our growth. Rondon saw it a different way. And by establishing the Indian Protection Service, he made the state an agent to do just that, to protect indigenous peoples. And that slogan of his, die if you must, but kill never, became official government policy. Now, he got kicked out of the government in 1930, but he came back in 1938 and continued this work of protection of indigenous peoples. And he, he was not wholly successful. But when I talk to Brazilian anthropologists and to leaders of indigenous groups, indigenous peoples in Brazil, they say that were it not for Rondon, things would have been much, much worse, and that in fact, we may have been completely wiped out. And it's because of his policies, the successes that he had, that Brazil's um, indigenous population, has now grown to 2 million or so people. And there's there's indigenous doctors, indigenous lawyers, a couple of indigenous members of Congress. Um, and, you know, his method of allowing individual tribal groups to decide for themselves what degree of engagement they wanted with mainstream society, um, has proven to be a viable method when the government is willing to follow it. The previous government, the government of Jair Bolsonaro from 2019 to 2023, tried to uproot everything that Rondon did, but they failed, thank goodness. And we now have a government in power that is doing its best to implement a Rondonian approach.
We touched on this a little bit earlier, but I'll ask it anyway. Suzanne wants to know, can you talk a little bit about his formal education? Did he go to university? I know, Larry, that he sort of had three options. He could have gone the military route, kind of gone the religious route, I guess,
Yeah,
or become a cowboy, as you said.
yeah,
So
right.
why did he choose the path he did? And talk a little bit about that.
Sure. I mean, where he grew up, um, there was really no schooling. There was a kindergarten, and that was it. Um, and his grandfather wanted him to be a cowboy, and it was expected that he would become a cowboy. He learned all these skills, tracking and hunting and herding, by the time he was 6 years old. But then um, the teacher in this little settlement recognized that he was an extraordinarily brilliant young, kid, and sent him off to the provincial capital so that he could get an education up to normal school, with the idea being that he would then come back and be a teacher in this rural setting. But Rondon wanted more, and as you say, Robert, his only two options, other than going back and being a cowboy, were to become a priest, and he was very skeptical of religion, of organized religion, or to go in the army. Those were the only two places where he could get a higher education. And so he chose the army, and he did the full course there, and he came out with 2 degrees, one in astronomy and one in military engineering. And um, you know, he for the rest of his life he was very much interested in scholarly pursuits and was a voracious reader in multiple languages for the rest of his life. So there's an element of self-education there, a little bit of Horatio Alger going on, but he also took advantage of every institutional opportunity that was available to him growing up.
So Diana asks, Rondon sounds like an amazing man. Could you please talk about why he brought weapons to the indigenous people, and what role did weapons play in the indigenous people's world?
Yeah, well, weapons is a big term. When I say weapons, I'm thinking not just of guns that the Indians could use to hunt and improve their diet. I'm also thinking of knives and axes and especially machetes. One of Rondon's more interesting statements is in a letter that he wrote to his religious guide. He said, machetes are the pound sterling of the Amazon jungle. They were so valuable because they could be used to cut down brush. They could also be used to butcher animals. So weapons, in the very broadest sense, not just guns, rifles, and pistols, um, but other utensils and implements that can be used as weapons, but are also excellent for farming and hunting and construction.
And Larry, as we start to wind down, can you talk a little bit about the process of writing the book? How long did it take you to write the book? You did cite several sources that you consulted, but what was it like writing this book?
Well, I mean, as I've indicated, the idea was in my head for decades. Um, but the turning point really was that New York Times um, uh, book review. And then I applied for a Cullman Fellowship at the New York Public Library, and in 2015 was accepted for that, which gave me access, gave me an office at the New York Public Library, and access to everything they had, which was an extraordinary amount of material on positivism and on the relationship with Roosevelt. So, that was a wonderful time. I love libraries. That's part of the reason I'm so happy to be doing this. And then I did research in Brazil, a couple of trips down there, long trips, months at a time. I remember going right after the Olympics ended and staying for the remainder of that year. Just every archive I could find. I did a trip in the Amazon along the trail where Rondon had built, a telegraph, just because I wanted to inject into the book some of the feeling of being in the Amazon, the heat and the humidity and the bugs and the fatigue and all of that. And the best way to do that was to, make a trip and take notes on that. So the book was written between 2015 and 2018, and it came out in Brazil in April or May of 2019. So let's say 4 years overall.
But I thought it was important to share his photo, so hopefully I'm doing that now. I'm attempting
Yeah,
to
yeah. I
anyway.
mean, I can see it.
There you go. All right, so Larry, it's just about 8 o'clock. We've gone to 60 minutes. Do you have any last words for the audience before we wrap it up?
Well, I mean, thank you for your interest. There's a lot of other things you could be doing on a Tuesday night. Um, and I appreciate your interest in the book. I appreciate your curiosity about um, Rondon and about Brazil. And, uh, for me, the great lesson of writing this book, and which I hope to pass on to readers, is that there's always another way of doing things, and that the way we always do things, um, you know, isn't necessarily the best way. We're raised as Americans to think that the everything we do is the gold standard, but writing this book, uh, I saw that there was a different way of doing things, and one of Roosevelt's big takeaways of his time with Rondon, the 6 months they spent together, in letters he wrote when he got back to the United States was, "Oh, I see that there is another way of dealing with issues like how do we deal with our indigenous citizens. Um, it impressed me, and I hope that if and when you read the book, that it will impress you. For all his flaws, he was still a great man and a remarkable figure in not just Brazilian history, but modern world history as well.
And as a complete aside, Larry, I did learn from your book that Teddy Roosevelt had a severe leg injury during while he was campaigning here in Massachusetts. That
Yes.
he got an infection and he his health was affected his entire life after that,
Yep.
including his 5 months with Rondon on the Amazon. All right, so Larry, let's give Larry a big virtual round of applause, folks, for a great presentation. Folks, look for an email from me tomorrow with a link to the recording, as well as information about some other upcoming virtual programs. I will also include a link to Wellesley Books, our official bookstore partner, if you want to purchase a copy of Larry's book. And when you exit the Zoom right now, please make sure to take the 7-question feedback survey. Your feedback is always greatly appreciated. So thank you all so much, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day. Thanks again, Larry.
My pleasure. Good night to all.
Good night.